Good morning. Today is February 11th, 2016, and I am interviewing Jerry Lowe at the Illinois State Library. Jerry is 90 years old, having been born on January 7th, 1926. My name is Sue Burkholder, and I will be the interviewer. For the recording, Jerry, would you please state in which war and branch of service that you served?
I was in the Marine Corps, and I was in during World War II, and I got discharged from the Marine Corps after World War II, and back in 1950 when the Korea conflict started, I went back in for 3 years, but during that period of time I was stateside all the time.
Okay.
All I did was issue electronic equipment there.
Ah, okay. Well, let's start with just a little bit about yourself. Can you tell us where you were born?
I was born in Lincoln, Illinois, in 1926.
And what about your family? Did you have siblings or?
I came from a family of 10, and right now I'm the last of the 10. And I was more or less in the middle. I had 4 sisters and 6 brothers.
Wow. Now, did before the war, what occupation did you have?
Everybody laughs when I tell them what it was. I was chicken sixer, and that is grading chickens. So you had the hens in one group and roosters in another group. And I went to school up in Shenandoah, Iowa for that. And then they grade you on how good you do it. And grading the chickens, I was hitting 98%, which is good for that.
That's interesting.
And a lot of people never heard of that occupation.
Did you have any other family members that joined the service?
I had 2 brothers ran during World War II, and I had another brother in during Korea. I had a brother in the Army during World War II, and his combat was mostly in the Philippines, and he was awarded a Silver Star for his action there. Then I had another brother, he was in the Navy, and he was training for a pilot, and they kicked him out because after he could fly and everything, but he kept getting lost coming back to the airport. So to tell you how the service works, he couldn't find the airport, so they made him a tower control to bring other planes in.
Oh, goodness. How did your family and friends then feel when you went into the service?
How did they feel?
How did they feel, yes?
Actually, I didn't get much comments from them, period, really.
Okay.
Because everybody was going at that time, so it was nothing unusual.
Mm-hmm. And were you drafted or did you enlist?
No, I was drafted during War II, and during Korea I went enlisted for 3 years.
All right. And, well, I was going to ask if you enlisted, why did you choose that specific branch, but...
When I was drafted, I didn't have a choice there. In fact, I reported up Chicago, and up there they gave all of us a physical. Then they move one group aside, then the next group, they gave us another physical. Then they lined us up, and then they went from 1 to 30. You're in the Marine Corps, and 31 on, you're in the Navy. So I was right next to a guy, and he wasn't in the Marine Corps, and I wasn't in the Navy, and they wouldn't let us trade.
Oh. Okay, well, when you got to Chicago then and began your training, what were those first days like, and how did you feel?
Well, it didn't bother me too much, because I'll tell you why it didn't bother me much. I'd been in an orphan home for about 5 years, so I was used to minding authority and stuff, and so there was no problem there. But I did learn one thing on that first day. This guy says, now whatever you do, don't volunteer, because you'll get enough on without volunteering for it. I always remember that.
And was that good advice?
Yeah.
And so did you do your basic training in Chicago?
No, I went from Chicago. They moved me out to San Diego, California, and the Marine Corps boot camp there. They had a fence on one side was the Marine Corps, and on the other it was the Navy boot camp, and that's where I went through boot camp for.
What was the early days like in training?
Well, actually, what I remember most, they tried to make sure that you followed command, and they tried to make sure that you wouldn't get blowed up if they asked you a certain thing or did certain things. So one of the things they used to do is, I told you there was a fence between us and the Navy. Well, they used to march our platoon right towards that fence, and we just kept going, walking right over the guy in front of us because we didn't dare stop on our own. Then there was another thing they did to see if you'd crack. We had a 5-gallon bucket. That's what we wash all our clothes in. Every now and then they'd call for inspection, so you'd get out in line, you'd hold that bucket in front of you, and you'd have your underwear and your socks lined up on there. So the inspecting officer came by me and turned about face to me and see my clothes. He hit it with his hand like that, knocked it on the ground, stamped on it. He says, "They were dirty, weren't they?" And I said, "Yes, sir." So they tried to see if you'd break.
So were there any of the instructors that are really memorable that stand out to you?
Well, I didn't realize it at the time, but we only had one DI for our platoon, and I was only 5'3", and he was a Texan. He looked like he was 7 foot tall to me. But he was strict enough, but he wasn't over. You could talk to him and reason with him, and he didn't get carried away like a lot of them did, so we were lucky on that part.
And what about specialized training that you might have received?
I didn't call it specialized training, but after boot camp, I was on my MOSs was a truck driver, and how it came about after I got out of boot camp, they sent me to transportation, and they had me drive all the vehicles, and I got to the big truck, which back then we called it 6x6, and I got in it, and the guy says, "Private, get out of there." He says, "Your feet don't even reach the pedals." So he says, now, he says, the medical battalion is wanting ambulance drivers. Would you want to do that? And I said, sure. So that's where I went. And then I learned to drive the field ambulance and the Jeep ambulance. And one thing on that, their training for the ambulance, we would use our big ambulance for training, and what we'd do, we'd have a driver drive it to the main gate, and we'd have it loaded with guys that was going on liberty. And then us guys who was training would drive back to our tent camp. So we were going out towards the gate, and the driver lost control of the vehicle, and it rolled over in the ditch, and I was underneath the ambulance, but there was a ditch there, and it didn't press me or anything. And I crawled out, and I kept blacking out and coming to, blacking out and coming to, and there was guys leaning over me talking, and I couldn't understand them, and I found out later there was a patrol of Dutch Marines, so I couldn't understand their accent. And then we had one Marine in there that was killed in the accident. Back then, the field ambulance had a canvas top, and they had steel bars running across it to hold up. One of those bars broke and went through him, killed him. And at that time, they wanted me to ride home with his body, but I didn't get out of the hospital in time to do that. And out of the 8 that was hurt, I was the only one that wasn't hurt too bad. I had left leg had ligaments tore loose, but other than that, I wasn't hurt too bad.
So when you were done with the training, what was your next move? Where did you go?
We went from San Diego, and the accident happened in August, and like a dumb young Marine, I was worried about I wouldn't get to go with my outfit. And I got out in late August and early September. We shipped out to Hawaii, and we ended up at Hilo, Hawaii. And they took us up across the volcano, and they had a camp they called Camp Tarawa, and that's where we did our final training.
And what training was there?
Well, that was for combat to go in. We didn't know it at the time, but they were getting us ready to invade an island, but we didn't know where it was.
All right. Well, and as you were doing the training there, how did you feel about that? What thoughts were going through your mind?
Well, I tell you what, the training didn't bother me too much, but there was a couple of events I remember of the civilians. And one of them was when we first got there at Hilo. Well, they took us on flat cars up to Tarawa, and as we went through the valleys, the Hawaiians, natives there, they threw bananas and stuff like down on welcoming us there. Then later on, after we was going through our training, they had two civilians. They had two little shacks off the base, and one, all it served was egg sandwiches, and the other one just served ice cream cone. And you stood in line for those, and you paid $25 for the ice cream and 25 cents for the ice cream, 25 cents for the sandwiches, and that was quite a treat back then. But the training didn't bother me that much.
Were there any other foods that you were able to enjoy while you were there?
Nothing that wasn't served. Yeah.
Nothing out of the ordinary?
Yeah, we didn't have any access to pop or candy bars or anything like that.
Okay. All right. So you've finished your training in Hawaii then, and then what was your next move?
We left our Hawaii and went aboard ship at San Diego. Then they took us up to Honolulu, which was where we were, actually where Pearl Harbor was, and we sat there a day aboard ship, and we didn't get to go ashore. And then they took off going northwest, and about halfway up there they showed us where we're going, and they showed us a map of Iwo Jima, and that's where we were supposed to land. And we ended up there just prior to February 18th. We were about there, and February 19th we started unloading. That's when we started going ashore. Now, my unit, we didn't actually stay ashore till the fourth day. The first 3 days, our main job between the ship and the shore was to pick up the wounded and take them back to their ship. And all the ships we were on called APA, and they were just transports, that our company doctors had set up a hospital aboard ship. So first 3 days we brought them all there that we could get out in Higgin boats. And then on the fourth day, the evening of the fourth day, we started setting up the field hospital, and I was there for 36 days then. But the odd thing about the field hospital, I was a Marine, and the first sergeant came up and says, "Lowe," he says, "they're losing so many corpsmen on the lines that they're starting to take them from the field hospital." He says, "and they're running short on men." He said, "Would you go up there and help?" And I said, "Sure." Excuse me. So I went up there, and that's all I did the rest of the combat mission. Like this here, I wasn't a corpsman, but I assisted the doctors by holding the arms and the heads and the legs of the wounded while he treated them. And that's what I did for 36 days.
And how did you feel during that whole time about, of course, what you were doing, or did you have much time to think?
Well, in reality, being in that hospital, field hospital, the first 2 or 3 days I can remember, but the other 30 days I don't recall any of the wounded or anything about that, except there was one event where when I originally started there, all I was supposed to do was check and see if they didn't have stomach injuries, and if they didn't have stomach injuries, I gave them a cup of coffee with brandy in it. And then after that then I started assisting the doctors and talked about the brandy. Our commander was a Navy doctor, and he was great on alcohol on his own. So every now and then he'd give each one of us a little bottle of that brandy. Well, I was young and never drank any beer or brandy or anything like that. So I gave it to my buddies, and one of them says, "Jerry," says, "you're stupid for doing that." I said, "Why?" He says, "Drink that, and when you're in that foxhole, you won't be cold all night." So I never gave it away again. And I don't remember too much even about the foxhole I was in at night, except that one night I do remember that the Japanese used flares, and their flares weren't that great. Sometimes after they'd shoot them up, the little parachute would open, and they'd come straight down at you, and you didn't ever move in the night or they'd pick you off. There's another event. The only time I was really scared, first night we was ashore, we came in late and we had to go over a mountain and stuff, and then they told us to dig a foxhole for the night. So I got out my shovel and started digging. I heard something metal. I took my hand, scraped, and it was a mine. So I crawled a little farther, dug a little bit, hit another one. So I moved a little farther, and I hit the third one. After I hit the third one, I just laid there all night on top of the ground, didn't move. And that was the only time I was real scared. But I didn't know it at the time. I was safe because they weren't personnel mines. They were for vehicles and heavy-duty stuff. But I don't remember too much time in the foxholes. In fact, I can't remember if I was by myself in a foxhole, if I had a buddy. Usually they tried to have a buddy where you slept back to back. So one would sleep and the other would watch out.
Yeah, what was the terrain like there?
The what?
The terrain.
Oh, when we went ashore, it was so bad you'd take a step forward and the ash was like a sand. It would just move, and then you'd have to just fight it. In fact, when the tanks first came in, they couldn't even move. They had to bring in what they called steel grates and put down, and then they drove over those until they got up on solid ground. But that was one of the handicaps. The ash was just so light that you step in it, you either sank or slid down. And I do remember in the foxhole a few nights, well, the artillery would move up close behind us, and when they'd fire over us, the concussion would cause all our sides to come back down into the foxhole again. Excuse me.
Yeah. What was the weather like while you were there?
In the daytime it was decent, but at night it got real cold. In fact, it got so cold at night that a few of us, there was a Red Cross supply area, we'd sneak in there and break open the units and get the long underwear out of there. But that's all it took, is long underwear. And we wore it probably a week at a time. And some of it we wore longer than that.
And how was it? Were the supplies able to get in regularly?
The supplies came in pretty good, really, except like, I don't think I told you, when I came ashore, my ambulance, a Jeep, had sank, didn't get in, and they had trained me as a backup as a field cook. And the field cook ranges didn't get in either, so that's who I was trained for. That's why they put me up in the field hospital.
Okay. So were there other duties then, aside from the field hospital, that you remember being asked to do?
No, I didn't do it. Other than that, now I did drive somebody else's Jeep a few times, and in fact, the one time I drove it, and he had to get out, at the field hospital, and one of his wounded had died, and they had me drive him down to grave registration. And the reason I remember that so bad, when I got there, I looked, and there was a big ditch, probably about 30 foot wide, and I don't know how long, but they had 30 Marines, each in a row, in the body bags, and at the very end, what bothered me, there was a bulldozer just pushing dirt over. But they had that all drawn out. They knew where every one of the bodies were. They had them ID'd. So after the war, they went there and dug them up and brought them back.
And how did that make you feel, seeing that?
Well, it made you realize how lucky you were to still be walking around, but that really bothered me more than anything. And the last day I was there, our unit was already leaving, and they made us stay half a day longer because we couldn't take our field hospital down until the Army had theirs set up. And so after that, we left. Well, we marched through the 5th Marine Division graveyard and went down and saw the people that we knew, and that was very touching. Yeah.
And how was it? I know it was a short time, but it was a violent war on there.
Yeah, we lost over somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 Marines there, and corpsmen.
And how did that, just thinking of the whole situation, how did that make you feel, or what thoughts, do you remember anything that you
Well, one thing you thought of, all the young men that were wasted, what they could have became, doctors, science, and stuff like that. That bothered you.
Did you make any close friendships while you were there?
Yeah, that was a mistake, though. But you got tied up with, we had about 5 in our group that were real close, and we lost one of them. And then when I went back in during Korea, I learned a lesson. I had 5 guys I went around with, but we never did get that close again, so we learned a lesson the hard way.
Yeah. So when you were leaving Iwo Jima, how did that kind of transpire, and how did you feel then?
Well, actually, we felt pretty good. We was glad to leave the place, and from there we headed back to Awoya then, and we went right back to Camp Taralva again. And there, we didn't know it then, but we were actually trained to invade Japan. So they was really putting us through the paces there.
And did you end up going to Japan, or just?
Well, I was, at that particular time, I was doing guard duty in Hilo, Awoya. We had a supply building down there, and they had 3 of us on guard duty, and one had to be on guard duty all the time, and the other 2 could go on liberty. So that's where we were on VJ Day, and we actually had to fire a couple of rounds up in the air because the civilians were celebrating so much they just thought they could walk right in there. So we had to stay on the ground there. And after we left Camp Taralva the second time, we went up by Saipan and Guam and never got off the ship, and then we ended up going up to Japan, and we ended up on the west side of Japan at the city called Sasebo, and we set a field hospital up for a few days at Fukuoka, Japan. And from there, in the middle of the night, they took us aboard trains, and I think they were afraid to tell us where we were going, but we ended up the next day down in Nagasaki, where the first second atomic bomb went off. And we were pretty well shook up over that. And everybody agreed, says, when you get home, whoever has a kid first lets everybody else know that they were all right. Because we thought everybody would be sterile from that. But nobody seemed to have any effect from it.
And how long were you there in Japan?
Well, I was there from September till August the following year. After the war was over, in December, my division went home, and they had a point system set up. Like if you're married, you had so many points. If you had kids, you had so many points. So being that I was one of the young ones not married, I had to stay, and the rest of the division went home. So I went from the 5th Marine Division. The next day, I had the same job and everything, but I was in the 2nd Marine Division. So we stayed there till August of 46. And the odd thing, when I was there with the 2nd Division, excuse me, my field cook training came into effect, because me and 2 other guys, we were cooks for the officers' mess, and that's all we cooked for that whole time. And they weren't geisha girls, but that's what we call them, because they dressed in kimonos, everything. Well, they did all the work. They hauled from the kitchen, set the tables, cleaned the tables, kept the place clean. At night, when we lay in our bunks, they'd come by and pick our clothes up. Next morning, they were all clean. And then the smart army had to come in and take over. They got rid of all the girls, and then we got Japanese boys. But they were good on account. They had a Japanese sergeant in charge of them. And for a Jap, he was big and heavy, and when he spoke, they moved. So we didn't have any trouble with them either. And another odd thing there, we had 2 kids there. They were probably 13 or 14, and they were our interpreters. And they were half Japanese and half French. And so they got along fine with everybody. In fact, after I got out of the service, she wrote me a few times. It was always one on toilet articles that girls use, because they couldn't get them over there, and I shipped them back. But then they wrote a few letters, and it just finally died away.
And when did you leave Japan then?
We left Japan just early August of 46.
And from there, where did you go?
From there, we went straight to the Panama Canal. But I can't say we went straight there. We went to the West Coast, because we had one rudder broke down, so we was just running on one. So we circled down and went through the Panama Canal and came up on the East Coast at Norfolk, Virginia. And what was bad about that, we had been overseas over 2 years, been in combat, and when we got off the ship, they had 2 fences, and we had to march through those fences, couldn't talk to anybody. From the ship to the train, you would have thought we was a prisoner's war. Nobody greeted you or said boo to you. Mm-hmm. And we think they had some military trouble with civilians just prior to that. And then from there, we went up to the Great Lakes, and that's where we finally got discharged after World War II.
And when was that? When were you discharged?
That was in August of 46.
Okay, so then what did you do after you were discharged?
Well, after that, I came home, and I worked for the state of Illinois for a while on the Division of Waterways. And we went around the state surveying and cutting lines so they could measure and gauge the banks and the creeks and stuff. And after that, I got a job driving a Pepsi-Cola truck. And I did that for several years. And then we had a 7-Up distributing plant in town. It was just one guy, so I took over that. But that paid good. But you didn't have any time on your own. You was up early to get out on the routes. Then you came back and you had to unload and do your book work and load up for the next day. By the time you ate and slept, it was time to do it all over again. So that's what I was doing when I went to back in during Korea.
And what prompted you to go? And
I had a kid brother that went in, and that had a lot to do with it. odd thing was we were both from Jacksonville, Illinois, and I was stationed in Jacksonville, Florida, and he was stationed in Jacksonville, Florida, and I was stationed in Jacksonville, North Carolina. So we had to watch after we put Jacksonville on what we put on the end of it.
Yeah. So you joined voluntarily this time.
Right, yeah.
And you joined, and how did it happen that you were heading to Korea then?
Well, I never did go to Korea.
Oh, you stayed stateside, that's
Yeah.
right. Okay, so
What I did,
tell us about that.
I was sent out from St. Louis. I was sent out to North Carolina to Camp Lejeune out there.
Mm-hmm.
And I was there a year and a half. And all I did was issued electronic equipment, me and two other guys. And then after I made sergeant, each outfit could only have so many of each rank. And so they had too many sergeants, so they shipped me out to Camp Pendleton, doing the same thing out there, and that's what I did a year and a half out there. And the only difference out there was we had barracks to live in. During World War II, we were in tents all the time.
So, is that the last place you were during your second round?
Right, second during Korea,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. I was there 3 years in electronics.
And then you were discharged.
Right,
And
yeah.
then what did you do when you were discharged?
Well, after I had about 3 months before I could find a job, then I ended up, working for Anderson Clayton, which later became Kraft Foods,
Mm-hmm.
and I worked there 38 years.
Well, let's see. How did you handle, like, switching your mindset when you came home? Especially after your first tour, coming home, and was it difficult, transitioning back into civilian life?
You mean after World War II?
Mm-hmm.
No, because actually nobody paid any attention to you. But I can remember I had one brother-in-law, he told his wife, he says, Uncle Jerry's no different now than when he went. I always thought that was kind of nice. But no, nobody even said anything to you about when you didn't come home real early after World War II. They didn't say anything to the others coming home. Mm-hmm. Nobody greeted you or anything else. We got on a bus and headed home.
And how was, how was your family when you came home? I know you had multiples in the service,
yeah.
But
there's only one bad thing about my family. After the war was over, and after the war was over and I was stationed in Japan, I had a sister that died, and I thought I wouldn't have any trouble getting to go home for the funeral, but they wouldn't relieve me. And so when I came home, I lost a sister. I didn't get to go to the funeral. That bothered me quite a bit.
So you worked at Kraft for a number of years, and did you join any veterans organizations?
Oh, yes. In fact, I joined all the vet groups in Jacksonville, the Marine Corps League, the VFW, the Legion, the AMVETS, but the only one I was real active in was the Marine Corps League, and that's where Jim and Jan are with us on that, and we're real active on that.
Okay. Have you remained in any contact with any of the people that you served with?
I remain in contact with two of the corpsmen and two of the Marines. Then I also got in contact with a Marine down in in Texas. He had lost both of his legs on Iwo Jima, and it just happened that I was reading a book, and it's called Surgeons of Evil, and it was telling about this guy got blew up in a minefield, and this corpsman crawled in and pulled him out, and one of the doctors says, do what you can with him, but I don't think you could save him. And so I was real friendly with him, and I says, I'm sending a book you might find it's interesting. He says, why is that? I says, well, go to this page, this paragraph, and it describes a Marine in a minefield lost both legs, and it tells the corpsman that pulled you out, and he couldn't get over that because he always wondered who it was.
So how do you feel that your experiences while you were in the service have affected you the rest of your life?
Well, you appreciate things a lot more, and you learn to tolerate things. There was not too much stuff that bothered you after that. That was about the main thing.
Do you feel like your experience have affected your thinking about the military, or like as it is?
Well, you think a lot about it when you figure that the young people that were killed. About after that, you thought every war was worthless because so many young people losing them. There's not much excuse for that.
Yeah. Well, are there any last words that you would like to say, maybe to the younger generation who are coming up, and it's a different world now than it was when you were in? Is there anything you would like to say to them? Somebody who might see this interview?
It's always like they used to say, your dad would go off to the service, and before he went, you realize how dumb he was, and when he came back, you realize how smart he was. So the kids need to learn to appreciate their families that they got right now, because they could lose them in a minute notice.
Okay. Well, is there anything else?
Not that I can recall.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank you very much for coming for an interview today, and thank you for your service to our country.
Well, I want to thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome.